Why did our ancestors, a million years ago, first decide to hold fire instead of run from it? For hundreds of thousands of years, humans watched lightning ignite the world into roaring sheets of orange, saw grasslands vanish under heat, and listened to predators scatter. Fire was terrifying, yet something about it kept pulling early humans closer, step by trembling step. This story will follow that long, careful approach. How curiosity replaced fear, how embers became technology, how cooking reshaped bodies, how nighttime warmth reshaped minds, and how a wandering species learned to cradle a force powerful enough to change evolution itself. Across 15 sections, the narration will track the slow shift from accidental encounters with wildfire to intentional mastery of flame, eventually showing why controlling fire around 1 million years ago counts as one of the great pivots in human history. And now, easing down from this introduction, the story glides into the moment when fire first entered the lives of creatures who didn't yet have names for light or warmth or danger, but felt all three of them in the marrow of their bones. Long before memory, when Africa was a patchwork of woodlands, grass plains, and volcanic highlands, early humans lived close to the edge of survival, balancing hunger, predators, and shifting climates. The beings we're talking about, likely Homo erectus or close relatives, were not yet storytellers, not yet firemakers, and certainly not yet the confident walkers of the future. They lived by stone, by instinct, and by whatever the landscape offered. For them, fire entered the world through sound before sight, a cracking boom of lightning splitting a distant tree, a ripple of thunder that shook the air, and then, after a moment, the faint scent of smoke drifting across the plain like a warning carried on invisible hands. The earliest encounters with wildfire were almost always disasters. Fire raced unpredictably, pushed by dry winds, eating through tall grasses, leaping from shrub to shrub. To an early human, flames behaved like a living creature, fast, hungry, and without mercy. Groups fled ahead of the burning edges, coughing as smoke thickened the sky, following instinctive paths toward safety. Yet, even in those chaotic moments, fire did something unusual. It left behind a transformed world. After the flames passed, the ground shimmered with blackened soil and cracked branches, but on that devastated land lay roasted tubers, exposed insects, and carcasses already cooked by heat intense enough to drive predators away. That quiet aftermath was the first moment humans ever tasted the advantages of fire, even though they had no part in creating it. Imagine one of them, a figure with dark skin toughened by sun, shoulders stooped not by age but by the weight of daily miles, picking through the smoky remains, feeling warmth underfoot, discovering that a root normally bitter becomes sweet after fire. Imagine the surprise, the tentative nibble, the widening eyes. From a biological standpoint, cooked food softens fibers, releases calories more easily, and reduces chewing time by nearly half. For a creature relying on plant roots and scavenged meat, this change mattered tremendously. But they did not know chemistry. They only knew that fire, for all its danger, left gifts behind. These early encounters planted a seed of curiosity, though curiosity was a sensation still growing inside those evolving brains. Fire presented itself as a paradox, destructive yet generous, deadly yet strangely beautiful. It warmed the ground even as it blackened it. It frightened predators even as it frightened humans. And in the days after a burn, new shoots sprouted quickly, attracting grazing animals whose presence meant hunting opportunities. Slowly, across thousands of generations, early humans came to associate the smell of smoke not only with danger, but also with possibility. There were moments when small, lingering pieces of fire, glowing branches, smoldering logs, pockets of heat under ash, lasted for hours or even days. These remnants fascinated early humans most. Picture them approaching cautiously, leaning closer, feeling the heat on their faces like a warm breath. The contrast between the cool air and the glowing ember would have been mesmerizing. Fire was light in a dark world, warmth in a cold night, a thing both alive and not alive. Every instinct screamed to keep distance, but something deeper urged them to look again, to understand the pattern of heat and glow. Scientists believe that the first relationship humans had with fire was observational rather than functional. They learned by watching how wood crackled, how wet branches hissed, how sparks flew upward like stars breaking free from earth. They noticed that fire dimmed without fuel, grew when fed, died when water touched it. These realizations didn't happen in one lifetime, but accumulated across tens of thousands of years as brains expanded and social groups grew more complex. It wasn't intelligence as we define it now, but a rising awareness, a shift from being passive observers of nature to becoming active students of it. The sensory experience mattered too. Fire touched every one of their senses. They heard it whisper in the dry season grasses. They smelled its smoky aftermath from kilometers away. They felt its heat long before daring to step closer. They saw colors they could find nowhere else. Amber, gold, red, a shimmering halo over charcoal. And if a brave or desperate individual reached out with a stick and felt it ignite, they would feel the vibration of power running up the shaft like a living pulse. These sensory encounters rewired pathways in their minds. Fire produced longer waking hours, even if only natural fires lit the evening sky. Those extra hours, researchers suggest, provided more time for social interaction, grooming, teaching, and even planning. It nudged early humans toward new cognitive habits, memory, anticipation, cooperation. But at this early stage, this age before mastery, fire was still a visitor, not a companion. Humans did not yet control it. They merely survived it, learned from it, and began to feel in some quiet corner of their minds that this strange force might someday be more than a threat. It might be a key. And understanding that key, recognizing its potential, marks the beginning of the long story to come. How from these first trembling steps near wildfire, the journey toward full control began, sparking the million-year transformation that would eventually shape everything about what humans became. Long before humans ever carried fire with intention, they trailed it across savannas like quiet shadows, drawn not by bravery, but by the strange pull of what lightning left behind. When a storm cracked the sky open and ignited tall grasses, early humans didn't merely flee from the blaze. They watched from a distance, tracking the smoke column the way a modern traveler might track a beacon in fog. Fire became a signal of disruption, and disruption almost always meant opportunity. The ground after a wildfire changed in ways no other force in nature could replicate, and early humans began to understand this through countless encounters shaped by climate, season, and need. When lightning struck in the dry season, the fire spread quickly, driving animals outward in wide arcs. Antelope, zebra, gazelle, even young rhinos fled in confusion, and predators followed. But behind all this movement came a zone of heat where small creatures, lizards, insects, rodents, were disoriented or killed. To an observant scavenger, this was a trove of calories uncovered without the need for chase or conflict. Early humans, who lacked the speed of the cheetah and the jaws of the hyena, found their own niche in the wake of fire, collecting what others overlooked. This adaptive behavior was not planned. It emerged gradually, encoded through repeated experience. Fire became an unpredictable but powerful provider, and humans adapted by becoming opportunistic followers of its path. Chasing lightning's gift required patience and timing. If they approached too early, the heat could burn their feet or choke them with smoke. Too late, and other scavengers would strip the land of anything edible. Over generations, groups learned to read the subtle transitions of a burn, the phase when smoke thinned, when the ground cooled enough to step on, when predators had already taken the largest carcasses but left behind marrow-rich bones cracked by heat. It was in these moments that humans found high-energy nutrition, fat, collagen, protein, packed inside roasted remains. Even plant foods were transformed. Tubers that required hours of chewing or dangerous toxin removal became soft, sweet, and immediately digestible once fire had touched them. Climate data from ancient East African sediments shows long cycles of drought punctuated by violent electrical storms. These were prime conditions for wildfire ignition. A single bolt could ignite kilometers of dry vegetation, turning the horizon into a glowing line of destruction. But for early humans, the event also reset territory boundaries. Burned zones attracted new plant growth within weeks, drawing herbivores, which in turn attracted predators, and all of that attracted humans. By chasing fire's aftermath, our ancestors learned the first lessons in long-distance resource tracking. They discovered that burned landscapes were temporary but predictable oases of abundance, teaching them to move with a rhythm deeper than simple migration. They followed fire not as passive victims, but as emerging strategists, piecing together patterns of season, storm, and renewal. These journeys often occurred during twilight or early morning, when the air cooled and smoke settled low to the ground. The sight of a distant glow, still smoldering after a stormy night, became something like a promise. Imagine a small band approaching such a glow, half walking, half pausing, scanning for danger, ears tuned for the crackle beneath the silence. The landscape would still be warm, dotted with pockets of heat where wood glowed faintly like hidden embers beneath ash. The air would smell of char and dampness, a blend indicating the fire was weakening. Early humans would step closer, testing the ground with sticks or stones, checking for stability, ensuring they could move through without injury. Once inside the burn zone, the feast was rarely dramatic but always meaningful. Ash-covered insects scurried sluggishly, easy to pick. Buried roots practically slid out of the softened ground. Occasionally, a small animal caught in the blaze provided an unexpected prize: pre-cooked protein at a scale no human had previously experienced by their own efforts. These discoveries rewired expectations. They introduced the possibility that food could be transformed by heat. They hinted in small sensory ways, taste, texture, smell, that fire did something beneficial beyond destruction. Even warmth itself became a pursued resource. Nights on the open savanna could be bitter, especially during seasonal winds. The lingering heat of burned earth offered a temporary sanctuary. Humans could rest in the cooled center of a burn, leaning against still warm stones, or sitting on patches of ground where residual heat seeped through their muscles. This warmth eased exhaustion, allowing groups to recover faster, move more effectively, and endure harsh environments with a resilience unmatched by other mammals. For ancestors without shelters or blankets, warmth was an asset as valuable as food. Through these repeated encounters, fire also taught danger awareness. Not all burns were safe to enter. Some concealed pits of burning roots or collapsed burrows, still steaming with heat. Groups learned to test ground integrity by throwing stones or watching for the shimmer of rising waves of heat. They recognized signs of fresh burns from old ones: white ash versus black char, sharp smoke versus lingering haze. This growing familiarity with fire's behavior expanded cognitive mapping skills, helping humans predict consequences more effectively. They began to sense that fire had patterns, even rules, and though they couldn't yet manipulate them, they could navigate them. As ancestral brains enlarged over hundreds of thousands of years, the urge to understand fire grew stronger. Curiosity wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Fire created opportunities no other environmental force offered at such scale. Not floods, not volcanic eruptions, not animal migrations. Fire alone reshaped ecosystems almost instantly. Early humans who followed it gained consistent advantages: calories, safety, warmth, mobility, while those who ignored it lagged behind. Evolution favors the curious, especially when curiosity leads toward resources that change the odds of survival. Imagine a child of that era walking behind the adults, dragging a stick through ash, watching how the slightest breeze revived a dying ember into a glowing red. That image captures the moment humanity began to relate to fire, not as an external threat, but as a phenomenon they might someday influence. The idea was not yet formed, but the seed existed. Chasing fire meant observing fire, and observing fire meant inching closer to understanding it. In time, fragments of burning wood would become more than scenery. Someone, perhaps accidentally, might pick up a smoldering branch to move it aside and realize it didn't burn instantly if held at the cool end. Such an experience, replicated across countless individuals and regions, introduced the idea that fire could be touched indirectly. It became a physical connection rather than a distant spectacle. And once humans learned they could move a piece of fire, even a few meters, the entire trajectory of human evolution shifted quietly toward mastery. But in this era of chasing lightning's gift, they hadn't yet reached that point. They were still students of a power they didn't fully grasp, drawn to its aftermath like moths drawn to safety rather than flame. Yet with every storm, every ignition, every blackened plain, they grew more familiar with what fire could do for them, and from that familiarity emerged the first faint stirrings of desire, not simply to find fire, but someday, somehow, to keep it. Before early humans ever dared to hold embers or shelter them, they spent generations simply observing fire, studying its moods, its flickers, its unpredictable leaps. These were the long watching nights, a time when curiosity thickened into understanding because every moment of darkness became a classroom lit by someone else's flame. Natural fires were rare enough to surprise them, but common enough to become familiar. And in that rhythm of unpredictability, humans learned something profound. Fire followed patterns, and patterns could be learned. Imagine a small band huddled on a ridge after a lightning storm, the night around them still trembling with the echoes of thunder. A wildfire glowed in the distance, no longer racing across the plain, but smoldering in slow, rhythmic pulses. Children stared wide-eyed at the distant brightness, while adults kept one watchful eye on predators pushed from their usual paths. The fire crackled faintly across kilometers, like an ancient drumbeat signaling danger and possibility in equal measure. For early humans, night was usually a time of fear. Hyenas laughed across the grasslands, lions patrolled unseen, and the unknown pressed inward from all sides. But when fire burned somewhere nearby, the darkness seemed less absolute, as though the world itself had developed a heartbeat that warded off the heaviest shadows. These nights stitched the first threads of understanding. Fire dimmed when wind calmed and brightened when a breeze picked up. Wet wood smoked, dry wood snapped loudly. Sparks always flew upward, never downward. The flame's movement wasn't random, but followed the contours of the land, crawling uphill faster than down, racing through grass but stumbling across bare earth. For the first time in their evolutionary story, humans encountered a natural force that behaved with enough consistency for them to predict its next move. This mattered. Predictability was the foundation of every skill they would develop later: tool use, hunting strategies, migration patterns, and eventually the mastery of fire itself. At these nighttime vantage points, groups gathered in silence, their bodies pressed close for warmth, their eyes fixed on the spectacle below. Long before spoken language developed into its modern form, gestures were enough to communicate the basics: safe, not safe, move closer, stay still. But the fire offered something else: extra hours of wakefulness. The glow on the horizon extended their day, delaying sleep not through comfort but fascination. Those extended hours created more social time, more observation time, and more mental processing time. Cognitive scientists argue that the slow expansion of nighttime activity played a subtle but crucial role in boosting brain development. Watching fire gave the mind something complex, living, and dynamic to study. Curiosity sharpened. As nights passed, early humans tested the boundaries of their fear. They edged closer to the dying flames, each step cautious, senses tuned for danger. Predator tracks often circled the burn edge where the weakest animals fell, but even those predators grew wary of the heat and the shifting shadows. Fire altered the usual rules of night, and humans learned to navigate within this temporary suspension of chaos. They understood, instinctively, that the fire's glow influenced animal behavior. That understanding nudged them toward protecting their own groups more effectively. When a smoldering tree trunk illuminated an area, humans could spot approaching movement earlier. When smoke drifted in certain directions, they learned to position themselves downwind or high on ridges where visibility stretched farther. Night after night, the patterns imprinted themselves. Over generations, thousands, maybe tens of thousands, humans learned what fire would likely do next, even if they didn't yet know what they could do with it. This knowledge was observational, not manipulative. But observation was enough to begin changing their mental landscapes. Watching fire taught them to anticipate danger hours before it arrived. It taught them to read the land. It taught them that the world had rules, and those rules could be learned and applied. Some bands began to approach wildfires deliberately, not just reacting to the opportunity, but seeking it out. They camped on ridges overlooking fresh burns, using the light to extend conversations, if early proto-conversations can be called that. Gestures became more refined, shared awareness deepened. When one individual pointed toward the flames and made a low, vibrating sound imitating the crackle, others responded. These exchanges were the seeds of symbolic communication, the idea that one thing could represent another. Fire might not have created language, but it amplified the conditions that made language more useful. The long watching nights also changed the relationship between adults and young. Children, usually shielded from predators and the dangers of darkness, were brought closer to smoldering landscapes because the light made the night feel safer. They absorbed knowledge at a pace adults couldn't match. They saw patterns earlier, drew bold conclusions, took risks with small glowing sticks discarded at burn edges. A child poking at the ash might learn that thick layers insulated heat, allowing embers to glow for surprisingly long periods. Another child might notice that certain wood smoldered longer than others. These tiny observations accumulated into generational memory, passed down through mimicry or demonstration. Watching fire became a shared ritual before rituals existed. It was communal, rhythmic, and emotionally charged. The glow on their faces created the first collective experiences that weren't strictly about survival or hunting or reproduction. It was something like awe, quiet, reflective, wordless. This emotional response mattered. Awe enhances attention, sharpens memory, strengthens social bonds. Fire provided all of these psychological benefits without yet being controlled. It was a teacher whose lessons seeped slowly into their minds. Over hundreds of thousands of years, early humans learned to judge the lifespan of a fire simply by its sound. A low rumble meant deep fuel, a sharp crackle meant thin branches, a hissing whisper meant moisture. These auditory cues helped determine when it was safe to approach, when food might be found, and when the fire would die completely. This was the beginning of predictive reasoning, a skill that would later influence hunting strategies, tool-making, and migration routes. In a way, fire trained their brains to think ahead. But perhaps the most important pattern they learned involved ember longevity. In the quiet after a wildfire, small pockets of heat could remain alive for days beneath ash, even when no flames were visible. Humans began to return to the same burned area repeatedly, surprised to find new hotspots rekindling when disturbed. They recognized that fire didn't just flicker and vanish, it had stages, like a cycle. Awareness of these stages set the stage for the next leap, keeping fire alive intentionally. The nights remained long, but they weren't as dark anymore, not because fire sat beside them, but because it lived inside their minds. By learning fire's patterns, they learned to imagine possibilities. And imagination, even in its earliest form, was the first spark humans ever truly owned. They did not yet know how to make fire, but they slowly learned how to keep it alive. This was the moment when humans shifted from being simple witnesses of flame to becoming its guardians, an evolutionary turning point so quiet and stretched across so many generations that no single individual realized it was happening. But looking back now, through the long arc of 1,000,000 years, this practice of keeping the first spark alive marks the dawn of human stewardship over a force older than life itself. It began with embers, glowing, fragile, easily lost. After a wildfire passed and the burn cooled, pockets of smoldering heat remained beneath ash, waiting for the slightest breath of wind to flare again. Early humans had already learned to recognize these hidden embers during the long watching nights, but now something new emerged, the desire to protect them. They discovered that if they covered embers with thick ash, they stayed warm longer. If they placed them under sheltering rock outcrops, they resisted the wind. The knowledge wasn't explicit, not yet. It lived in muscle memory and instinct, passed down through imitation rather than speech. Picture a band moving through a recently burned valley. One adult kneels by a glowing log, its center still pulsing with quiet light. She blows gently, watching orange bloom through cracks like veins awakening. The log is too large to carry, but small pieces break off easily. She tests one with a stick, nudging it out of the charcoal bed. When the fragment rolls free, still glowing at one end, the realization clicks in her mind. not consciously, but physiologically. This can move. The ember can travel. Early attempts to carry fire were clumsy. They grasped smoldering wood with leaves, strips of bark, or green branches still wet with sap. Many attempts failed. Embers cooled too quickly or burned fingers or fell apart mid-journey. But even failures taught lessons. They learned that certain woods held heat better. Dense hardwoods smoldered longer, while dry grasses died instantly. They learned to wrap embers in layers of thick leaves or place them between slabs of damp bark. Some groups placed tiny coals into hollowed pieces of wood or stone depressions lined with powdery ash. These methods were primitive, inconsistent, and often dangerous, but they worked often enough to matter. Carrying fire changed everything. Suddenly, humans were no longer tied to the unpredictable rhythm of lightning storms. They could travel with warmth. They could arrive at new territories already prepared to ignite old logs. They could cook in places untouched by wildfire. Even without making fire, they had begun the process of owning it. And ownership, however fragile, fostered creativity. The social dynamics around fire changed as well. Keeping embers alive required cooperation. Someone needed to check them regularly, adjusting ash layers, turning smoldering pieces, or shielding them from rain. During migrations, certain members, often the most attentive or experienced, were entrusted with the embers. This role became a position of respect, even if not formally recognized. The ember keepers, though not called that in their own time, were among the first specialists in human history. Their careful attention might preserve fire through an entire season. Their mistakes could leave the group cold, vulnerable, and forced to wait months for a new natural ignition. This responsibility fostered new cognitive habits. Planning, foresight, and patience became essential. Ember keepers learned to anticipate when fuel would run out, when weather threatened to smother their precious heat, when travel speeds needed to adjust to protect the coals. These shifts nurtured executive functions in the brain. Those same abilities that later supported complex hunting strategies, extended tool-making sessions, and eventually symbolic rituals. Firekeeping wasn't just a physical act, it was mental training disguised as necessity. Around this time, humans began to gather fuel intentionally for the first time, not to ignite, but to sustain what they carried. They recognized that certain fallen branches caught fire more readily, that resinous wood smoked heavily, that green wood delayed burning. They collected chunks of wood from one region and carried them into another, creating small caches near resting spots. This simple behavior seeded the idea of resource management, of preparing for a future need rather than responding to an immediate crisis. Once a group managed to keep fire alive long enough to bring it back to a familiar shelter, perhaps a shallow cave or a wind-shaded hollow, they experienced something new. The glow that once belonged only to wildfires now lived quietly beside them. A small hearth of embers, fed with dry twigs, could flare into flame for the first time under human attention alone. They still hadn't produced sparks from scratch, but they had learned how to coax flame from heat, which is another form of creation. They fed it, they shaped it, they protected it from wind by arranging stones in small arcs, discovering that even crude walls could control airflow and steady the flame's behavior. The first hearths were not constructions, but adaptations, depressions in the ground, natural shelves, hollows in rock. Over generations, these spaces evolved into deliberate fire spots, cleared of debris and surrounded by stones that acted as heat reservoirs long after flames died. A hearth changed the night. It offered a small circle of safety, a buffer against predators, a gathering place for grooming and bonding. Firelight lengthened the hours of community and gave humans space to share silent exchanges and gestures that slowly shaped early forms of communication. Keeping the spark alive also changed the emotional texture of early human life. Fire became a companion, not in a sentimental sense, but in an existential one. It offered comfort that no previous generation had consistently known. The warmth eased tired muscles. The light softened fear. The glowing embers created a sense of continuity across nights and seasons. Even when flames were low or absent, the knowledge that fire could return with a little breath, a little fuel, formed the first fragile thread of psychological security. There were nights when embers nearly died. Rainstorms drowned them, winds scattered them, carelessness extinguished them. In those moments, the group fell back into the uncertainty of darkness, listening again to the distant laughs of hyenas, fully aware of what they had lost. This reinforced the value of ember guardianship. Fire became precious precisely because it was perishable. Losing it meant vulnerability. Keeping it meant resilience. Over time, the cultural memory of firekeeping grew stronger. Children learned early that embers were not toys. Adults taught them through gestures how to blow gently, how to avoid breathing too hard, how to angle their hands to block wind. A child might spend hours experimenting with dried grasses, discovering how quickly they ignited and how easily they vanished. These subtle lessons grew into foundational knowledge that prepared future generations for the next leap, true ignition from scratch. But for this era, keeping the spark alive was enough. It marked the first controlled relationship between humans and fire, a fragile parenthood, a gentle stewardship. They could not yet summon fire at will, but they could hold on to it, and that single ability changed how they traveled, how they bonded, how they thought, and ultimately, how they evolved. The first spark they kept wasn't just a piece of glowing wood. It was the start of a long conversation between humans and flame, one that would shape every moment of their future. This was the age of ash, bone, and roasted roots, a slow, transformative era when fire stopped being merely a source of light and warmth and became a tool that changed how humans ate, how they grew, how they hunted, and ultimately, how they evolved. It was not dramatic, not a sudden revelation, but a long accumulation of sensory experiences that taught early humans something radical. Heat could unlock food in ways nature never had. It began with the simplest foods, roots and tubers. These starchy underground treasures had always been a major part of the early human diet, but they came with a price. Raw, they were tough, fibrous, hard to chew, and often packed with compounds that irritated the stomach. Eating enough of them required hours of grinding teeth against dense plant matter. But once fire touched them, everything changed. A tuber tossed into the glowing ash to be forgotten for a while emerged soft, fragrant, and sweet. Heat broke down the complex carbohydrates, releasing calories more freely than raw chewing ever could. What had once required long bouts of jaw strength and time could now be eaten quickly and efficiently. Imagine our ancestors kneeling near a shallow hearth, ash swirling lightly in the air as they reached in with a stick to hook a baked root and drag it out. The outer skin charred black, but peeling it revealed steaming flesh inside, soft enough for a child's first teeth. A single roasted tuber offered more immediate energy than several raw ones combined. That additional energy didn't just feed bodies, it fed brains. And the human brain, already on an evolutionary path toward higher complexity, soaked up that fuel eagerly. Cooking also allowed humans to safely consume foods previously off-limits or only marginally beneficial. Certain plants that once caused mild sickness lost their toxicity when heated. Tough fibers broke down. Nuts and seeds released more oils. Even honey, when warmed slightly, flowed more easily from comb fragments. Fire unlocked calories nature never intended to be accessible all at once. This shift in bioavailability is one of the core reasons anthropologists believe cooking played a vital role in the dramatic increase of brain size in Homo erectus. A large brain demands enormous energy. Raw foods alone rarely supply that energy efficiently. Fire changed that balance. Bones, too, became an opportunity. Heat cracked them. In the aftermath of wildfires, humans had already found marrow exposed without effort. Now, with fire at hand, they could create that effect themselves. A bone placed in the edge of a hearth, dried, weakened, and eventually split with the right pressure. Inside was marrow, fatty, nutrient-rich, life-sustaining. To early humans, marrow was like hidden treasure. It provided long-lasting energy, carried vital vitamins, and burned slowly in the belly. Even predators sometimes overlooked smaller bones, but humans, with fire-hardened sticks and clever hands, extracted every last drop. Cooking meat brought another layer of transformation. Raw meat carried pathogens, required strong jaws, and demanded long digestive times. Cooked meat, by contrast, softened, became more digestible, and released amino acids more efficiently. A small group shared a fire-cooked meal in less time and with less strain than any raw feast could offer. The act of eating itself changed. Chewing became easier, freeing jaws to evolve toward lighter, smaller structures over generations. This physical shift, smaller jaws, smaller teeth, larger brains, was not instant, but built slowly over hundreds of thousands of years, guided in no small part by the new possibilities of cooked food. Fire also created the first primitive form of food storage. Charred surfaces resisted rot longer than raw flesh or plants. A piece of fire-dried meat could remain safe to eat for days. Even roasted tubers lasted longer, their outer skins forming protective layers once exposed to heat. Food that once spoiled quickly now stretched across longer intervals. This extended predictability changed social patterns. A group with food that lasted longer did not need to roam constantly. They could stay near a promising water source or linger in a cave with good shelter, knowing they had calories stored in the ash and smoke of their hearth. Cooking also changed the sensory landscape of early human life. The smell of roasting meat signaled safety and abundance. The scent of sweetened tubers drew children close. Smoke drifted into hair and skin, becoming the scent of home, masking the natural odors that might otherwise attract predators. The crackle of a roasting bone became an auditory marker of nourishment, a sign that the night would not be spent hungry. These sensory associations deepened emotional bonds within groups, making shared meals not just acts of survival, but moments of connection. And as meals improved, so did cooperation. A single person tending a fire could prepare enough food for many. Sharing became easier, more natural, more rewarding. With fire, one hunter's success or one forager's discovery fed the entire band, strengthening social cohesion. The idea of communal benefit, of ours instead of mine, took root around the hearth, fed by the practicality of cooking and the difficulty of maintaining fire alone. Humans became more cooperative because fire made cooperation advantageous. Even the act of cooking invited experimentation. Early humans learned that burying food under ash produced different textures than placing it atop burning wood. They discovered that wetter wood produced less intense heat, ideal for slow cooking, while dry wood created fierce flames better suited for quick roasting. Over time, they created simple but effective cooking techniques: ash baking, ember roasting, fire drying, and even using hot stones to hold steady heat. These methods arose not from deliberate innovation, but from thousands of tiny accidents, each one noticed, remembered, repeated, and passed on. The nutritional explosion that cooking provided also altered daily schedules. With easier meals, humans spent less time chewing and more time doing everything else. More time for socializing, more time for tool-making, more time for nighttime gathering around the glow. More time for teaching children, more time for exploring, migrating, planning. Fire bought them time, and that extra time became fuel for culture. Cooking even changed landscapes. Fire attracted animals, whose bones humans then collected. It attracted other humans, bringing groups together. Overlapping territories became meeting places where cooking smells carried through the air, turning isolation into interaction. Ideas followed those interactions. Techniques spread. And slowly, so slowly that no one living at the time could have noticed, the entire species changed course. By cooking roots, cracking bones, and roasting meat, humans turned nature's randomness into something predictable, something they could count on. Cooking was not merely a convenience, it was biological alchemy. It remade bodies, it refined senses, it expanded minds. Fire transformed everything it touched, but the greatest transformation occurred inside the humans who learned to tend it. The hearth did not yet symbolize home, that would come later, but it had already become the center of life. And from that glowing center rose the next great shift, the gathering of people not just for warmth or safety, but for connection. Fire, once a distant phenomenon chased across the plains, now lived in the heart of the group, transforming the behaviors, emotions, and relationships of the humans who sat beside it. And though their nights were still filled with danger and uncertainty, the glow that pulsed in their shelters carved out a small but powerful zone of safety where new kinds of connection could unfold. Imagine an evening in a shallow cave or beneath an overhanging ridge. Outside, wind sweeps through tall grasses, carrying the distant sound of hyenas calling to one another. Darkness dominates the landscape, thick and unforgiving. But inside the circle of humans, the night is gentler. A small fire crackles, sending thin threads of smoke upward, its light dancing across rough stone walls. Faces appear and disappear in the shifting glow. Shadows ripple behind them like silent companions. For the first time in their evolutionary history, humans have an anchor in the dark. This anchor changed everything. Before fire, nighttime meant vulnerability. Vision failed, hearing sharpened to detect threats, bodies huddled together for warmth, but fear kept them restless. With fire, the balance shifted. Predators hesitated at its edge, wary of the brightness and heat. Even a small flame extended the safe perimeter by dozens of meters, providing early warning of prowling eyes. The simple knowledge that fire repelled danger allowed humans to relax in ways their ancestors couldn't. Relaxation led to longer rest, deeper sleep, and stronger physical recovery, core ingredients of resilience. But the most profound shift was social. Fire created a focal point, a center around which humans gathered without planning, without commands, simply because it felt right. Circular seating may have been the first true social architecture. Sitting in a circle meant everyone could see everyone else. Eye contact became regular rather than accidental. Expressions gained meaning. Gestures evolved subtlety. Emotions became visible. Around this small ring of light, communication took a leap forward. Even without modern language, early humans shared information through the smallest cues: body posture, hands moving in broad, slow arcs, the angle of a head, the rhythmic tapping of a stick against stone. These exchanges deepened group awareness. If one person noticed a distant rustle in the dark, the entire group responded. If someone pointed toward a smoldering log needing fuel, others understood. Firelight granted visibility, and visibility granted opportunities for cooperation that daylight alone had never offered. The circle around the flames also nurtured teaching in a way no previous environment had. In the daylight, survival demanded constant movement, scavenging, foraging, tracking, traveling. But at night, with the group stationary and protected, adults finally had time to demonstrate simple techniques to young observers. How to gently blow on embers without scattering ash, how to place sticks at angles to encourage airflow, how to dig a shallow pit so that wind didn't extinguish fragile flames. Children learned to mimic these behaviors with wide-eyed wonder, their tiny fingers tracing the motions of adults. Sitting by fire gave them a front-row seat to the earliest lessons in skill, care, and patience. These evenings also strengthened emotional bonds within the band. Touch became more frequent, hands resting on shoulders, siblings leaning against one another, elders guiding children closer or farther from the heat. Fire softened the atmosphere, encouraging closeness that might otherwise be rare in the harshness of the day. Shared meals, cooked slowly over embers, created communal moments that reinforced group identity. When people ate together from the same fire, their survival became intertwined. The hearth blurred the line between individual and collective needs. Firelight also reshaped storytelling before storytelling existed. Humans have always been meaning-seeking creatures, and the flicker of flame invited imagination. Movements in the light turned simple gestures into expressive performances. Shadows cast on cave walls created visual narratives long before spoken tales emerged. A hunter might demonstrate, through motion alone, the path of an antelope and the moment of a successful strike. A forager might show how certain roots grew under soil or how snakes coiled beneath logs. These demonstrations were not yet stories in the modern sense, but they were seeds of narrative thinking, choreographed memory passed on through the dance of light and shadow. Another critical change emerged. Time itself expanded. Fire extended the day into the night, granting hours of activity beyond what darkness once allowed. These extra hours became the cradle of developing cognition. More time for planning, more time for problem solving, more time for social grooming, more time for quiet reflection, a psychological space rare in the frantic pace of diurnal life. With fire, the human mind gained breathing room, and that room allowed minds to grow. Fire also offered comfort to the elderly, a segment of the population whose wisdom mattered, but whose physical limitations once hindered group mobility. An older individual might sit near the flames and stay warm while sharing knowledge through gestures or teaching younger members how to maintain the fire. Their role, once diminished by age, became essential in transmitting behavioral traditions. Fire granted them relevance long after their physical strength waned, and with relevance came the deepening of social complexity. The circle around the flames even shaped the earliest forms of conflict resolution. When disagreements arose, over food, over territory, over errors in firekeeping, the hearth provided a shared ground where tension could soften. Sitting face to face in warm light made it easier to settle disputes than in the chaos and fear of daylight competition. Fire encouraged clarity, calm, and compromise. The steady breathing glow served as a reminder of what the group must protect. Conflict threatened the stability of fire, and the group instinctively avoided anything that put their warmth and security at risk. Over generations, these nights built the foundation of what would eventually become culture. The circle became the original social classroom, the original theater, the original council chamber. It was where trust formed, where ideas spread, where group identity emerged, where the first faint notions of belonging, sharing, and cooperation took shape. Even the arrangement of stones around a hearth hinted at the future. Humans were beginning to modify their environment not just for survival, but for comfort, predictability, and social structure. This subtle change foreshadowed villages, then towns, then cities. The hearth was the earliest blueprint for human community. And as these circles of light grew more important, fire became more than a tool. It became the center of human life and connection. It bound people together not just physically, but emotionally, cognitively, and socially. The flame at the center was small, but its influence was vast, shaping not only what humans did, but who they were becoming. From these glowing circles, the next great shift emerged. Fire was no longer a force humans chased or inherited by accident. It was becoming a companion they carried with them across distances and landscapes, a traveling partner on the long road of migration. Once humans learned to keep embers alive across nights and through storms, a deeper transformation unfolded. Fire stopped being a stationary resource and became a traveling companion. No longer bound to the unpredictable generosity of lightning, early humans began carrying fire with them across valleys, rivers, forests, and eventually continents. This shift appears small in the scale of a single lifetime, but in the scale of 1,000,000 years, it marks one of the most profound changes in human history. Fire was no longer a force discovered, it was a force transported. And through that transport, humans reshaped not only their environment, but also the story of their migration. Imagine a small band preparing to leave a familiar shelter. The decision to move was never made lightly. Seasonal changes might dry out a water hole, herds might migrate onward, leaving the land quiet and empty. A storm might strip a region of edible plants or shift predator territories. When the group decided to travel, everyone had a role. Scouts scanning ahead, foragers gathering what they could, children carrying small bundles of possessions. But always, at the center of their preparations, one or two individuals tended to the precious ember bundle. This bundle, the ancestor of every torch, every hearth carried forward, every traveling flame, was wrapped carefully in layers of leaves and thick bark. The embers inside glowed faintly, protected by ash and insulated by material that allowed just enough airflow to keep them alive. The ember carrier walked with special caution, cupping the bundle close, shielding it from wind or sudden movement. Every so often, the group paused so the carrier could open the bundle, check the glow, blow gently into the heart of it, and add a small piece of fuel. The entire band watched silently, aware that the ember represented far more than light. It represented continuity. Carrying fire transformed migration patterns. Before fire, movement was often restricted to daylight hours and safer seasons. With fire in hand, humans could move earlier in the morning, later into twilight, or under the faint wash of starlight with glowing embers guiding careful steps. Fire also allowed them to establish temporary resting spots that were warmer, safer, and more stable than anything their ancestors had known. Even a new, unfamiliar stretch of land became less threatening when a hearth could be coaxed back to life within minutes of arrival. This newfound freedom encouraged exploration. Humans could settle briefly near lake shores, linger near caves, or rest beneath stone overhangs, always knowing they carried the spark that made each place livable. As they moved deeper into unfamiliar territories, regions with colder nights, thicker forests, or predators they had never encountered, fire provided the confidence to push forward. A cold evening no longer guaranteed misery. A dark forest no longer hid total danger. Fire was protection, and protection meant mobility. Migration routes expanded. Across Africa, early humans followed rivers that cut through savannas, tracked herds across wide grasslands, and crossed mountain passes that once would have been too cold or too risky. Archaeological evidence shows that Homo erectus reached regions far beyond the equatorial warmth, including North Africa, the Levant, and parts of Eurasia by nearly 2 million years ago. Fire did not create these migrations, but carrying fire stabilized them. Humans could survive harsher nights. They could deter new predators. They could cook unfamiliar foods. They could endure climates that once pushed them back. The sight of fire in motion altered the visual signature of human travel. At dusk, when movement slowed, the ember carrier sometimes lifted a glowing stick to check surroundings or signal to others. The faint red light would ripple across faces and reflect in wide, alert eyes. In dense forests, fire allowed humans to ward off cold dampness and repel insects. In rocky highlands, firelight made terrain clearer, preventing falls. Even in open plains, a glowing ember was a reminder that the group carried a piece of home in their hands. Traveling with fire also changed interactions with other bands. When two groups encountered each other unexpectedly, drawn by water sources, shifting herds, or simply crossing paths, the presence of fire signaled capability. A group that carried fire was prepared, resilient, and less desperate. It announced that they had the knowledge to maintain flame, a shared skill that both impressed and reassured. Sometimes embers were exchanged between bands, a silent gesture of trust or gratitude. These exchanges represented some of the earliest acts of intergroup cooperation. Carrying fire influenced toolmaking as well. Traveling long distances meant adjusting fuel resources to local environments. Humans learned early on that certain woods smoldered longer than others. Dense hardwoods were ideal for ember bundles, while soft woods served better as kindling. This knowledge shaped the routes they chose, moving toward groves known for reliable fuel rather than across barren plains where firekeeping became risky. These decisions were among the first examples of environmental planning shaped directly by technological needs. When rains swept across the land, the ember bundle demanded extra attention. Carriers learned to tuck embers inside hollowed logs or carry broad leaves overhead as shields. Sometimes they found natural shelters and waited out storms, huddling together while one individual protected the ember with their entire body. Losing fire during migration was not simply inconvenient. It was a blow to safety and morale. Groups without fire moved cautiously, seeking natural ignition or meeting another band who might share their flame. These moments reinforced the value of firekeeping and elevated the status of those who mastered it. With fire as a companion, humans ventured into colder latitudes where nighttime temperatures once barred their presence. Fire allowed them to dry damp hides, warm trembling limbs, and sleep without constant shivering. It enabled them to process food in environments where raw resources were harder to digest. It eased the shock of the unknown, giving stability amid constant change. Even the act of resting changed. Instead of pushing through miles in search of safe shelter, the group could stop wherever the landscape allowed, arrange stones or branches, and kindle a new hearth from their ember. Fire made rest predictable. Predictability made long journeys more manageable, and manageable journeys made expansion inevitable. This mobility set the stage for the slow diffusion of human populations across continents. Asia, with its forests and river valleys, became accessible. Europe's colder climate became survivable. Even high-altitude regions once inhospitable could be temporarily explored, thanks to the warmth humans carried with them. Over tens of thousands of years, these incremental expansions reshaped human diversity, exposing groups to different climates, predators, foods, and landscapes, all while carrying the steady glow that kept them alive. Fire became not just a tool, but a companion in the truest sense. It traveled where they traveled, slept where they slept, ate where they ate. Its presence dictated rhythm and pace, shaped decisions, and anchored group identity. It offered stability in a world defined by movement. And in this long journey, humans learned something deeper than survival. They learned that they could shape their fate through the care of a fragile, glowing ember. The next transformation would push that relationship further. Humans wouldn't just carry fire, they would use it deliberately to transform the land itself, wielding flame not just as a companion, but as a force they could control, direct, and unleash at will. This was the age of taming the flickering beast, when early humans learned to guide flame across landscapes, shaping the world with intention rather than reacting to nature's whims. They did not yet understand ecosystems or chemistry, but they understood results. And through countless small experiments, some accidental, some deliberate, they discovered that fire could become a strategic tool for hunting, foraging, protection, and environmental management. The first hints of controlled burning likely came from observation and opportunity. Humans had long noticed that after a wildfire, vegetation returned greener, softer, and more abundant. Herd animals flocked to these rejuvenated patches, nibbling on new shoots. Predicting this cycle allowed humans to plan hunting around burn scars. Eventually, they realized they didn't have to wait for lightning. They could encourage similar outcomes by placing their own fires along the edges of grasslands or in the dry underbrush of forests. The earliest intentional fires were small, cautious, and tightly monitored. A single burning branch pressed to a clump of dry grass, a few steps back to see how flames behaved, a quick stomp to control its direction. Even a tiny human-started blaze represented a monumental shift in perspective. Fire was no longer solely nature's creation. Controlled burns began as a way to flush prey. A group of hunters might position themselves along a line of tall grass, holding smoldering sticks. At a signal, likely a gesture rather than a sound, they touched those sticks to the ground. The flames crawled outward slowly, guided by wind and fuel. Small animals panicked, darting toward open areas where hunters waited with sharpened wooden spears, hardened at the tip by fire. These spears, strengthened by careful roasting, penetrated deeper and held their shape longer than untreated wood. Fire enabled the hunt, from the moment animals were flushed out to the moment weapons pierced their hides. Such controlled burns also protected camps. By selectively clearing dry brush around their living spaces, humans created a buffer zone against natural wildfires. This early firebreak reduced the risk of being caught in sudden infernos. It also improved visibility at night, cutting down on ambushes by predators. Fire served as both offense and defense, reshaping not only the land but the boundaries of safety. This new mastery required a better understanding of materials. Over generations, humans learned which grasses ignited quickly, which shrubs produced dense smoke, which tree resins burned fiercely. They learned the behavior of fire on slopes, the influence of wind direction, the speed at which flames traveled through different environments. These insights accumulated into something like an early science, applied knowledge derived from trial, error, observation, and memory. Fire became an extension of their minds. The taming of fire also redefined plant gathering. Many edible plants grew more efficiently after controlled burns. Roots were easier to locate in cleared soil. Nuts and seeds became more accessible when dead brush was eliminated. Even hunting insects, grubs, larvae, or colonies hidden beneath bark, became simpler when old logs were partially burned to expose the nutritious insides. Humans expanded their diet by using fire not just in cooking, but in procurement, breaking open ecological niches unavailable to other species. This practice, sometimes referred to by modern anthropologists as fire stick farming, allowed humans to shape their environment so consistently that entire landscapes changed over centuries. In open grasslands, repeated burns kept forests from encroaching, maintaining habitats that supported large grazing animals. In forested regions, small burns created mosaic patterns of vegetation at different stages of regrowth, attracting diverse animal populations. By guiding fire through terrain, humans indirectly guided the movement of prey, something no other creature had achieved. These controlled burns had another crucial benefit. They reduced fuel accumulation. Dry leaves, fallen branches, and dead undergrowth often built up into thick layers that, under lightning, produced catastrophic wildfires. By burning selectively and frequently, humans prevented these massive fires, keeping ecosystems more stable. They didn't intend to practice environmental risk management, but through observation and necessity, they did exactly that. As controlled burning became more common, fire transformed into a kind of migratory tool. Humans planned seasonal movement around where they had set fires months earlier. They returned to areas knowing new vegetation would have grown, animals would have gathered, and the land would be easier to navigate. These burn cycles created predictable patterns in an unpredictable world, giving humans a level of security never before experienced in their evolutionary history. But even as they tamed fire in the wild, they also learned to tame its behavior at home. Hearths grew more sophisticated. Early humans arranged stones in ringed patterns to contain flame, understanding that rock absorbed and radiated heat long after the fire died. They created shallow trenches or depressions to direct airflow, learning that fire burned hotter and cleaner when oxygen flowed properly. Some groups stacked stones to reflect heat inward, effectively creating the earliest fire chambers. These modifications were not yet architecture, but they hinted at the human instinct to design space around comfort and utility. As fire use expanded, the line between danger and mastery grew thin. Controlled burns occasionally escaped, turning deliberate fires into destructive ones. But even these mishaps taught lessons. Humans learned what conditions were too risky: wind too strong, fuel too dense, land too dry. They adapted their strategies, adjusting their timing to seasonal humidity or previous burn history. This ongoing dialogue between humans and flame accelerated learning and innovation. Fire also became a psychological companion in a new way. Starting fire on purpose created a sense of agency almost unimaginable to earlier generations. Humans could shape the behavior of an elemental force with intention. This control likely fostered confidence, planning, and a deeper sense of cause and effect. When a small blaze created by their own hands reshaped a hillside or cleared a pathway, the understanding of personal influence grew sharper. Fire wasn't just help, it was empowerment. The taming of fire fostered symbolic power as well. Flames meant opportunity. Smoke on the horizon could signal another band's burn, prompting curiosity or caution. Sparks spiraling upward became a familiar sight, reminding humans of continuity. Firelight guided decision-making at night, facilitated social rituals, and anchored group cohesion. Humans treated fire with a combination of reverence and practicality, a dynamic that continues in human cultures today. As intentional fire use spread, humans were on the cusp of a deeper cognitive shift. They understood that fire changed the world and that they could change fire. This feedback loop between environment, flame, and human thought accelerated evolution in ways subtle and profound. And from this growing mastery would emerge the next great leap. Fire would not only shape landscapes and hunting strategies, it would shape minds, bodies, and the very architecture of the human brain itself. Fire wasn't just transforming landscapes, it was transforming brains. This age, which we might call the smoke that changed the brain, marked one of the most profound shifts in human evolution. The warmth, the cooked calories, the extended nights, and the ever-present glow of embers created a psychological and biological environment that reshaped neural pathways, encouraged imagination, strengthened social bonds, and accelerated cognitive development in ways no other force in nature could match. Imagine an early human sitting close to a hearth, watching smoke curl upward in soft ribbons. The hypnotic movement of flame and smoke did more than entertain. It invited prolonged attention. Most animals struggle with sustained focus, yet fire demanded it, subtly, gently. Watching a fire was both calming and cognitively stimulating. It required monitoring and small adjustments, adding a stick at the right time, keeping embers alive, noticing wind shifts. These tasks trained working memory, foresight, and sensory integration. Brains sharpened not through violent struggle, but through quiet observation. Warmth played a major role as well. Before fire, early humans endured nights that challenged their survival. Shivering burns calories rapidly and disrupts sleep, leaving bodies exhausted and minds foggy. Fire's warmth stabilized nighttime physiology. Muscles relaxed, heart rates slowed. Deep sleep, critical for memory consolidation, became more achievable. A species that slept more deeply, more regularly, and more safely naturally developed stronger cognitive processing. Over generations, these sleep-enhanced brains accumulated advantages in problem-solving, communication, and emotional regulation. Smoke added a different kind of influence. It permeated shelters, hair, skin, and lungs. While heavy smoke inhalation is harmful, light or intermittent exposure may have triggered subtle neurological responses. Some researchers suggest that the calming effect of watching fire and smelling smoke may have soothed stress responses, easing fear circuits in the brain. Whether through direct chemistry or indirect comfort, fire's presence reduced the overwhelming vigilance required in predator-filled darkness. A calmer mind can think more broadly, imagine more freely, and engage socially without constant threat perception. But the biggest shift came from cooking. Cooked food delivered more energy with less effort, allowing humans to redirect metabolic resources toward brain growth. The human brain consumes an extraordinary portion of the body's energy, about 20% today, far more than other primates. This energy cost is sustainable only with an efficient calorie intake. Fire made that intake possible. With softer foods, humans spent less time chewing and digesting and more time engaging in activities that demanded cognitive engagement, tool-making, socialization, planning migration routes, teaching children. Over tens of thousands of years, these patterns favored individuals with slightly larger, more capable brains, and those individuals passed their advantages on. But beyond biology, fire shaped cognition through culture. The extended evenings it provided created long stretches of time for mental exploration. In the dark, illuminated only by the shifting glow, humans developed the first seeds of imagination. The moving shadows on cave walls created illusions of animals, spirits, or distant landscapes. Minds began to form associations, craft visual narratives, and organize memories in more complex ways. Firelight encouraged introspection, an unusual and uniquely human mental space where ideas, fears, and possibilities could blend. These nighttime gatherings also nurtured the earliest proto-stories. Even before structured language existed, humans communicated through gestures, sounds, and rhythm. Firelight created the perfect stage. Someone might reenact the chase of an antelope, exaggerating movements in the flickering glow. Others watched, understanding not just the actions but the intent behind them. These moments built theory of mind, the ability to interpret others' thoughts and motivations. It is no exaggeration to say that around the fire, storytelling was born in the silent language of bodies and shadows. As cognitive abilities expanded, so did emotional depth. Firelight softened facial expressions, making them easier to read. Humans began to recognize subtle cues of sadness, joy, fatigue, or trust. This recognition strengthened empathy. Empathy, in turn, made cooperation more powerful. Group cohesion improved. Parenting became more attentive. Relationships became more complex. Emotional intelligence grew not through written wisdom or moral codes, but through hundreds of thousands of quiet nights where humans sat close enough to feel each other's warmth and see each other's eyes flicker in the glow. Fire also changed learning itself. Children raised around fire had new ways to observe adults and mimic their behavior. They saw tool-making clearly in the night, watched the placement of stones around a hearth, learned how to adjust airflow, how to judge heat, how to handle ember bundles. Fire exposed the details of skill long after daylight faded. This extended visibility accelerated the transmission of knowledge. Skills no longer died with the setting sun. Because fire created predictable cycles of light and darkness within the shelter, it also gave shape to early social routines. People gathered at night, dispersed by day, and returned again. This repetitive rhythm fostered the beginnings of ritual, a subconscious consistency in behavior that reinforced group identity. Ritual behavior activates memory, strengthens social ties, and anchors cognitive frameworks. Even small acts like adding fuel at the same time each evening or arranging stones in familiar patterns created psychological stability. And stability nurtured creativity. Another transformative influence was risk reduction. With fire at their side, humans no longer trembled through the night fearing unseen predators. The reduction of constant terror freed cognitive resources once reserved for survival. With safety came curiosity. Curiosity sparked experimentation, and experimentation fueled innovation. Fire didn't only protect, it liberated. As brains grew more capable, humans began to use fire in increasingly innovative ways. They discovered that certain stones cracked predictably when heated, leading to better tool shapes. They learned that smoke repelled insects, making certain areas more habitable. They recognized that fire dried plant materials, making them easier to weave or store. Each new skill enriched the cognitive environment, pushing the boundaries of mental capacity. Fire also set the stage for symbolic thought, the glow of embers, the contrast between light and darkness, the dance of shadows. All of these elements invited metaphor. Humans began to see patterns in fire's behavior that echoed patterns in life: birth, growth, death, renewal. Though these meanings were not yet encoded in language, they lived in the shared quiet of firelight gatherings. Symbols were born before words, and most profoundly, fire influenced the deep emotional sense of home. Before fire, shelter was only a place to hide. With fire, shelter became a place to belong. This shift in emotional geography shaped how humans formed communities, how they raised children, how they planned their futures. The hearth became the nucleus of social identity, and the brain evolved to thrive around it. Every cooked meal, every shared evening, every lesson taught in the glow of embers nudged the human mind toward greater complexity. Fire was not merely a physical tool, it was a neurological catalyst. It rewired minds, reshaped relationships, and opened the door to imagination itself. And from those expanding minds came the next transformation. Humans learned not only to think more deeply, but to apply that thought to shaping the tools and materials around them, forging a new level of mastery that would echo across the ages. Fire, once a frightening force, now became a collaborator in crafting tools, altering materials, and reshaping the physical world. This section marks the moment when humans began using heat not only to cook, but to change the very structure of wood, stone, and eventually earth. What began as accidental discoveries near the edge of a flame grew into intentional practices that expanded human capability in every direction. It likely started with wood. Early humans had long used wooden spears for thrusting and digging, but these weapons were limited in durability. A wooden point dulled quickly. It splintered, bent, or broke under pressure. But one night, as a hunting party returned to camp, someone might have leaned a sharp stick too close to the fire. In the morning, the tip was blackened and brittle, but it also pierced more cleanly into soft ground. The surface had hardened. This was a subtle shift, but one meaningful enough that human hands noticed. A few more experiments, pressing the tip closer, rotating the shaft, finding the right distance from the flame, and the first fire-hardened spear was born. Fire-hardening wood became a crucial breakthrough in hunting. A spear strengthened by flame penetrated animal hide more effectively and resisted bending. Hunters gained confidence, knowing their tools were more reliable. Better spears meant more successful hunts, more protein, and more consistent survival. This feedback loop, heat improving tools, tools improving hunting, hunting improving diet, diet improving brain power, accelerated human evolution. The ability to modify materials using fire shifted technology from improvisation to intention. Fire also shaped stone. Long before humans learned to create smooth, sharp edges with refined techniques, they discovered that certain stones behaved differently when heated. Heat made some stones fracture in predictable lines, forming flakes ideal for cutting or scraping. Flint, for instance, responded especially well to controlled heating, a process now known as heat treatment. When ancient toolmakers heated flint just below its breaking point and allowed it to cool slowly, the stone became easier to knapp, producing thinner, sharper, more intricate blades. These discoveries were rarely sudden. They unfolded gradually, accumulating through countless encounters with stones exposed to fire after cooking, burning brush, or maintaining hearths. Perhaps someone noticed that stones left near a fire cracked in useful ways. Perhaps another observed that rock heated during cooking pits split cleanly when struck. Over generations, these insights gathered into deliberate practice. Early humans began placing stones near the edges of fires for extended periods, learning how much heat produced which effects. They learned to avoid overheating, which caused explosive shattering, and to favor gradual warming, which produced workable textures. The refinement of stone tools marked a turning point in human culture. With sharper edges, humans could process animal hides more effectively, creating clothing and shelters suitable for colder climates. They could carve wood with greater precision, fashioning handles, digging sticks, or carrying tools. They could butcher animals quickly, reducing exposure to predators. They could scrape bark, cut vines, and prepare plant materials for weaving. Fire, indirectly, enabled all of this by elevating tool-making from crude improvisation to sophisticated craftsmanship. Heat also offered humans new ways to manipulate plant materials. When certain vines or branches were warmed gently, they bent more easily without breaking, allowing early humans to craft simple frames, baskets, and supports. Heat softened resins and saps, enabling their use as adhesives for attaching stone blades to wooden shafts. These beginnings of compound tools, tools with multiple parts, represent some of the earliest engineering in human history. Without fire, adhesives remained weak. With fire, resins became versatile, forming the basis of hafted stone axes, spear throwers, and other advanced implements. At the same time, fire played a role in shaping early shelters. Humans learned that heated stones retained warmth for hours after flames died. By placing these stones strategically around sleeping areas, they created pockets of comfort during cold nights. Stones heated during cooking could be carried into crude shelters to provide warmth, creating a kind of prehistoric radiant heating. Understanding how stones absorbed and released heat required attention and memory, reinforcing the growing cognitive sophistication fire had nurtured. Even soil and clay were transformed. In regions with clay-rich earth, fire accidentally revealed one of humanity's earliest forms of material science. A small hearth built on clay sometimes left behind hardened patches after repeated heating. These baked surfaces resisted erosion, stayed dry, and felt different underfoot. Early humans may not have understood why, but they recognized the effect. In time, they likely used this knowledge, intentionally or not, to reinforce portions of shelter floors or create firmer cooking surfaces. Although true pottery wouldn't emerge for many tens of thousands of years, the seeds of ceramic awareness were planted in these early fire interactions. The act of caring for a fire itself trained hands in dexterity and precision, placing fuel, adjusting embers, managing airflow. These required fine motor movements that strengthened neural connections. Firekeeping became a kind of daily practice, shaping manual skill long before specialized crafts existed. Investigating how different materials burned, dry grass versus resinous wood, damp logs versus bark, gave early humans an intuitive understanding of material properties. That understanding formed the foundation for future technological leaps. Hands learned not only how to shape fire, but how fire shaped the environment. When early humans conducted controlled burns, they altered terrain in ways that highlighted useful materials. Heat cracked stones open, revealing colors, patterns, and textures previously hidden. Burned landscapes exposed roots and tubers, guiding digging tools. Charred wood became easier to break, teaching humans how fire weakened and strengthened materials in different conditions. This worldly understanding, how heat affected physical matter, became an early form of scientific thinking. Not formally articulated, not measured, but deeply integrated into daily life. Fire also elevated cooperation around tool-making. As tools became more complex, their creation demanded shared knowledge. One individual might perfect the technique of heating stone, while another excelled at knapping. Another learned how to bind stone to wood using heated resin. Tool-making became a communal skill set, reinforcing social bonds and making group survival more interdependent. This collaboration fostered teaching behaviors, elders showing youths how to rotate a spear point near embers or how to watch for the color change in heated stone. These exchanges reinforced cultural learning, passing practical wisdom from generation to generation. With every new tool, humans gained more control over their environment. Fire-hardened spears extended their reach. Heated stone blades increased their precision, warmed shelters improved their rest, resins softened by flame expanded their creativity. Fire forged not only tools, but the mindset that tools could always be improved. That mindset, once ignited, never dimmed. This era of hands learning heat's logic marked the quiet beginning of human inventiveness, a shift from simply using what nature offered to transforming nature through ingenuity. Fire was no longer merely a companion or a source of comfort. It had become a collaborator in craftsmanship, a partner in experimentation, a catalyst for innovation. And as humans continued shaping the world with fire-warmed hands, they turned toward another realization. If fire could transform materials, then perhaps shelters themselves could evolve to better cradle the flame at the heart of human life. If fire could travel with them, and if it could strengthen tools, warm bodies, cook food, and anchor social bonds, then shelters themselves would need to evolve to hold it. This marked the age of shelters that held the spark, an era when humans began intentionally shaping spaces not just for hiding from wind or rain, but for protecting and sustaining fire. This subtle shift reshaped the relationship between humans, their environments, and the flame that illuminated their nights. The earliest versions of these shelters were not built, they were chosen. A shallow cave, a rock overhang, the mouth of a narrow ravine. Humans selected places that shielded embers from sharp gusts and provided natural walls that reflected heat. A cave that once served merely as temporary refuge now became a favored site because fire behaved predictably within it. Flames stayed upright instead of flickering wildly. Ashes collected neatly in hollows. Smoke drifted upward through cracks or out the entrance in regular patterns that could be studied and anticipated. The ability to observe airflow inside shelters marked a turning point. Humans noticed that smoke always traveled along certain paths, tracing invisible routes through the air. These paths taught them how to position hearths more effectively. If smoke funneled upward at the back of a cave, fire belonged near that spot. If winds entered from the left side, the hearth needed to be nestled against a warm stone wall where the draft couldn't extinguish it. These decisions were instinctive at first, but over generations hardened into knowledge, passed on through gesture, imitation, and memory. Gradually, humans began modifying their chosen shelters. They cleared debris, removed fallen branches, and reorganized rocks not simply to sit, but to support fire. Small stones arranged in a semicircle helped contain the flame, preventing sparks from leaping toward bedding made of dried grass or leaves. Larger rocks were placed behind the hearth to reflect heat inward, warming the deepest corners of the shelter. Sometimes stones were moved to create makeshift windbreaks, reducing the chance of embers scattering during storms. These actions marked the earliest steps toward architecture, crude, practical, and guided entirely by the needs of fire. With improved hearth placement came improved comfort. Nights that once felt perilously cold became tolerable. Humans could now sleep deeper and longer inside warm enclosures. The warmth also provided a stable environment for infants and the elderly, increasing survival rates across the age spectrum. More individuals living longer meant more knowledge retained, more traditions passed on, more innovation. The presence of fire inside shelters also changed spatial organization. Areas near the hearth became gathering spots, zones of communication, teaching, tool-making, grooming, and resting. Peripheral areas stored food or served as sleeping spots for those wanting distance from smoke. The far ends of caves sometimes became storage areas where items dried slowly from the gentle heat. Fire organized space, turning shelters into functional zones. These were the earliest human homes, not in the modern sense of design, but in the emotional sense of familiarity, belonging, and routine. Over time, humans began building structures specifically to house fire. In regions with fewer natural caves, they crafted simple windbreaks made from branches, animal hides, or piled stones. These enclosures weren't fully closed. They were partial barriers designed to protect embers from wind and rain. A carefully placed hide could shield the hearth from sudden gusts. A ring of thick branches might insulate the area. Gradually, these modifications grew more deliberate. People added new layers when wind patterns shifted, reinforced weak points after storms, or experimented with different materials for better stability. In colder climates, such as the outskirts of what is now Europe and Central Asia, humans faced harsh winters that tested their ability to keep fire alive indoors. Caves became preferred shelters not just for protection, but because their stone walls absorbed heat and radiated it slowly throughout the night. Hearths in these caves grew in sophistication. Some were dug into the ground to hold coals safely during sleep. Others were built atop flat stone slabs to prevent moisture from extinguishing embers. Humans might even create shallow bowl-shaped depressions lined with clay-like soil that hardened over time through repeated heating, primitive fire pans that controlled flame more efficiently. These innovations also made smoke management crucial. Early humans learned to direct smoke by analyzing how it behaved inside different shelters. They discovered that placing the hearth near a natural crevice or fissure allowed smoke to escape. In low-ceilinged areas, they positioned fires closer to the entrance to avoid suffocating fumes. Over generations, the placement of fire became strategic rather than arbitrary. This emerging environmental manipulation foreshadowed the architectural mastery humans would develop millennia later. An important social ritual formed around shelter-bound fires, the maintenance of the hearth. Fire inside a shelter needed far more attention than fire outside. Sparks could ignite bedding, smoke could build dangerously, embers could burn too low during the night. Assigning responsibility became essential. Certain individuals, often the most reliable or attentive, managed the hearth during the darkest hours. Their job was to add fuel periodically, adjust airflow, and ensure the flame never died. This practice elevated firekeeping from a skill to a duty, strengthening social structure and reinforcing cooperative living. As shelters became steadier, the climate of human life changed. The hearth made nights brighter, longer, and more stable. People could process food indoors, working on animal hides or grinding plant materials without fearing the cold. They gathered around the hearth during storms, exchanging silent glimpses or practicing gestures that would later evolve into language. The glow gave space for early symbolic thinking as humans decorated the walls or arranged objects near the flames in meaningful ways. The hearth also became a marker of territory. A cave with a well-maintained hearth indicated long-term use, encouraging groups to return season after season. A single ember kept alive within a shelter symbolized continuity across generations. Fire anchored humans in place long enough for patterns of settlement to form. While still nomadic, bands now had favorite locations, shelters that felt familiar, trustworthy, and imbued with the memories of fires past. In these spaces, humans began to experiment further. They tested different kinds of fuel, dry grass for quick ignition, hardwood for slow burning, bone for long-lasting embers. They noticed that burning certain materials changed the color of smoke or altered its smell. This sensory learning helped them refine fire use for different tasks: bright flames for visibility, low coals for cooking, thick smoke for repelling insects, soft embers for warmth. And even without formal language, the hearth communicated ideas. Its warmth reassured, its light revealed, its rhythmic crackle structured the night. The sight of a glowing hearth from afar, a faint orange pulse at the mouth of a cave, signaled habitation, safety, identity. The shelters that held the spark became the first human homes, not because of walls or roofs, but because they sheltered the flame that sheltered humanity. This quiet revolution set the stage for something even more profound. With fire now living inside their dwellings, humans began to perceive flame not only as a tool or a companion, but as a presence with meaning, a force that inspired reverence, awe, and the earliest forms of ritual. When flames danced and embers pulsed like tiny hearts, early humans sensed a presence they could not name. This was the dawn of rituals born from glowing coals, a time when fire crossed the threshold from practical tool to symbolic force, shaping the emotional, spiritual, and imaginative life of humanity. The roots of these rituals began in silence. After a day of movement, hunting, or gathering, the band would gather around the hearth. The flames cast shifting shadows that stretched and swayed on cave walls, warping the shapes of bodies and tools. Children watched wide-eyed as silhouettes grew enormous or shrank into nothing. Adults, tired and contemplative, stared into the embers, letting the patterns of flickering light pull their thoughts inward. With no written language, no spoken myths, no formal prayers, these quiet moments became the first seeds of symbolic experience, direct encounters with a force that seemed alive. Psychologically, fire encouraged stillness. Its mesmerizing rhythms slowed breathing, softened tension, and drew minds into states of reflection. In this meditative calm, early humans began connecting experiences, forming associations, and weaving meaning into the world around them. Fire warmed their bodies, cooked their meals, protected their shelters, and guided their tools, creating a profound emotional bond. The flame was dependable, yet unpredictable, comforting, yet dangerous, living, yet not alive. It was the first phenomenon humans both relied on and feared, making it the perfect catalyst for ritual behavior. One of the earliest forms of ritual emerged through simple, repeated actions, adding fuel at the same times each evening, arranging stones around the hearth in familiar patterns, sweeping ash from certain spots, replacing embers in others. These habits were not yet devotional, but they carried the seed of reverence. Doing something the same way, night after night, transformed survival tasks into meaningful routines. Children learned to follow these patterns through imitation, cementing the rituals across generations. Another ritual arose from the relationship between fire and death. When animals were hunted and butchered, bones sometimes found their way into the fire, crackling, hissing, splitting open to reveal marrow. The transformation from body to ash, from form to smoke, hinted at mysteries humans could not articulate. They watched as flames consumed the shape of a creature, leaving behind only brittle fragments. This process suggested a cycle, life becoming fire, becoming dust. Over time, humans may have associated fire with transition, an invisible border between what was living and what lay beyond. Though there is no evidence of human cremation during this early period, the conceptual seeds of fire as a transformative force were taking root. Among the most profound early rituals centered on light and shadow. When humans waved burning sticks in the dark, perhaps to scare predators, perhaps to entertain children, the light traced trails in the air, leaving glowing arcs that lingered briefly in vision. These glowing patterns became a kind of ephemeral art, shifting the way humans perceived movement, space, and self. Some began experimenting further, moving torches deliberately, creating shapes with the flames. Others mimicked animals or ancestors through body movements amplified by shadow. These moments of spontaneous performance foreshadowed the earliest storytelling rituals, long before language blossomed into complex form. Over time, certain individuals showed sensitivity to fire's behavior. They understood how it breathed, how it flared with dry wood and dimmed with lack of oxygen. These individuals may have been seen as special, keepers of knowledge about a force that felt powerful and mysterious. They became early ritual leaders, not shamans or priests in the modern sense, but people who watched fire closely and interacted with it confidently. They could coax flames from stubborn embers, predict when smoke would shift, or choose the best materials for specific effects. Their skill with fire gave them quiet influence within the group. Rituals also emerged around protection. Fire was fragile, easily extinguished by rain, wind, or carelessness. To keep it alive was to protect the soul of the shelter. Certain gestures, cupping hands around embers, blowing with controlled breaths, shielding flames with bodies, became acts of devotion. The hearth was tended as though it were a living being. Losing fire was not merely inconvenient, it was a communal failure. Thus, tending the flame became a sacred responsibility. Even the colors of fire inspired symbolic behavior. Early humans distinguished between the deep orange glow of embers, the bright yellow of active flames, and the blue hints that appeared in especially hot fires. They noticed how flames changed color with different woods, how smoke thickened or thinned, how soot accumulated. These perceptions fused into early forms of meaning-making. Red and orange became colors of life, warmth, and energy. Black soot represented danger or death. White ash symbolized what remained after transformation. Firelight also revealed the human face in new ways. Emotions became visible in ways daylight never allowed. A face illuminated from below flickered between expressions, soft, severe, joyful, sorrowful. Humans learned to read emotional microshifts in one another through fire's glow. In these intimate moments, rituals of comfort, mourning, bonding, and reassurance were born. A hand on a shoulder in firelight carried more meaning than in darkness. A shared silence around a hearth could ease grief or express gratitude. Another early ritual likely involved the offering of food to the flame. Whether by accident or intent, dropping a piece of meat, fruit, or root into the fire created a spectacle. Hissing, crackling, sometimes flaring. The sensory burst captured attention. It hinted at exchange. Humans gave something, and fire responded immediately. This interaction may have seeded the idea of reciprocity between humans and the natural world, a foundation for myth-making and spirituality later on. Smoke itself inspired ritual behaviors. Rising into the air, drifting through cave openings, merging with the sky, smoke felt connected to something beyond the human realm. Watching it ascend may have sparked early ideas about spirits, ancestors, or unseen forces. Some groups may have interpreted unusual smoke patterns as signs or messages. These interpretations were simple, pre-verbal, yet profound, for minds newly awakening to symbolic thought. But perhaps the most important ritual of all was the act of gathering. Every night, humans returned to the same hearth. They sat together, shared food, rested, groomed one another, and simply existed in the same circle of warmth and light. The gathering itself became a ritual, a daily reaffirmation of group identity. Over time, this regularity created the first sense of continuity, of a shared past and an anticipated future. The fire became a thread that connected generations, linking memories across time. As these rituals deepened, fire's meaning expanded. It was no longer just a source of heat and protection. It became a teacher, a guide, a mysterious companion whose presence shaped emotions and beliefs. Fire's glow illuminated not only the cave walls, but the interior landscape of the human mind. And from these rituals, quiet, subtle, instinctive, would emerge a new idea. If the hearth gave safety and meaning, then it could also become the anchor of place. Fire would not only shape minds and tools, it would shape where humans chose to stay. Fire had become more than warmth and safety. It was now the emotional center of the group, the anchor of memory, the symbol of continuity. And because fire felt most dependable when sheltered, when protected from wind, rain, and wandering predators, humans began gravitating toward places where they could keep the flame alive, not just for a night, but for days, weeks, even seasons. This was the dawn of the hearth as a home seed, the moment when fire encouraged humans to stay longer in one place, laying early foundations for settlement and eventually for civilization itself. Imagine a small band approaching a familiar cave or a rocky alcove that had sheltered their ancestors many seasons before. The walls are darkened by layers of soot from countless past fires, each layer a silent testament to human return. The floor is smoothed by generations of sleeping bodies, and beneath a shallow mound of ash lies the ghost of an old hearth, long cold but still recognizable. When the band rekindles their fire in this same spot, they are not just surviving, they are participating in a growing sense of place. This pattern, returning again and again to the same shelters, became one of the first threads binding humans to specific territories. The presence of fire made certain locations more attractive than others. Caves with natural chimneys for smoke became prized. Overhangs protected flames from sudden storms. Rocky basins near water and abundant plant growth became seasonal hubs. Fire influenced these choices subtly at first, but its impact accumulated steadily. Areas with good fuel resources, dense wood, dry grasses, hardwoods for long-burning embers, became central hubs. Humans learned where the best firewood grew, where lightning often struck to replenish embers, and where strong winds made firekeeping difficult. They began mapping territories not only by food and water, but by fire potential. As groups stayed longer in favored shelters, their routines deepened. Hearths became semi-permanent fixtures. Rocks arranged to contain flames were left in place even when groups moved on temporarily. Ash pits grew deeper, stone tools accumulated. Bones left near the hearth built layers of occupation. Archaeological sites many hundreds of thousands of years old reveal these patterns, evidence of repeated returns to the same living spaces. Humans were not yet sedentary. But they were no longer fully nomadic in the old sense. They lived in cycles of movement centered around a handful of reliable home sites. With these longer stays came changes in social structure. A stable hearth offered a predictable place for raising children. Infants and young children, vulnerable, slow to develop, deeply dependent, benefited immensely from consistent shelter and warmth. Mothers could care for them with less constant movement. Elders could remain in familiar spots, helping with tasks and passing on knowledge without being left behind. The hearth strengthened intergenerational bonds, which in turn strengthened cultural continuity. Skills related to firekeeping, tool-making, gathering, and hunting were taught more reliably when groups stayed long enough for structured learning to emerge. Staying longer in particular places also encouraged humans to observe their environment more deeply. They noticed subtle seasonal changes in plant growth. They tracked animal migrations with greater accuracy. They learned which areas flooded in the rainy season and which dried out in the dry season. These observations planted the early seeds of ecological knowledge, knowledge that would much later enable agriculture, but for now empowered humans to return to their home shelters with precise timing. The hearth also became a furnace of innovation. When humans stayed in one place longer, they had more time to refine tools, experiment with materials, and develop new skills. A calm evening in a sheltered hearth chamber allowed for more concentrated knapping of stone tools, more careful shaping of wooden implements, more detailed processing of hides. These innovations spread slowly but meaningfully. The more time humans spent in stable environments, the more sophisticated their toolkits became. At the emotional level, the hearth fostered attachment. Humans began developing a sense of belonging tied to specific locations, something no other species displayed to the same degree at that time. The cave with the recognizable soot markings, the riverside with a familiar wind shelter, the grove where the best firewood grew. These were the first places humans felt connected to. They had memories here. A successful hunt, a shared meal, the birth of a child, the survival of a harsh winter. Fire lit the backdrop of these memories, making the places themselves feel important. Over time, humans encountered other bands returning to the same desirable shelters. These meetings could be tense or harmonious, depending on the season and available resources, but the hearth often played a mediating role. If one group arrived to find another's fire burning, the smoke signal conveyed occupation and warned the newcomers to approach carefully. Yet in times of abundance, shared hearth sites fostered exchange of food, tools, mates, and ideas. These interactions strengthened genetic diversity and cultural resilience. Shelters with hearths became social hubs where networks formed, memories accumulated, and traditions expanded. Some shelters grew so familiar that groups left behind intentional markers, small collections of stones, shaped hearth pits, or patterns in the ash. These markers weren't symbolic in the modern sense, but they carried meaning for those who returned. They signaled continuity, belonging, and identity. Humans began to recognize themselves not just as wanderers, but as members of groups tied to places through fire and memory. As humans spent more nights in the same shelters, they also transformed the immediate environment. Surrounding areas were cleared of dry wood and brush both for fuel and safety. Paths formed naturally through frequent movement. Areas near the hearth became conditioned by heat, dry, soot-stained, free of insects. Over years and generations, these microenvironments developed into early forms of managed landscapes. Humans weren't farming yet, but they were shaping the land through repeated habits centered around the hearth. The hearth also guided the development of more complex shelters. Windbreaks grew into partial walls. Piled stones became sturdier structures. Simple lean-tos expanded into multi-season dwellings. Humans experimented with enclosing spaces more fully, seeking better control over airflow and smoke. Some groups built small stone rings or earth mounds to cradle their hearths, creating a designated central point in the shelter. This center became the heart of the structure. Even as walls shifted, expanded, or collapsed, the hearth remained constant. These semi-permanent hearth sites also helped humans endure more extreme climates. In colder regions, they reinforced entrances with hides or branches to trap warmth. In rainy regions, they selected high ground and used overhangs for smoke ventilation. They became masters at micro-adaptation, adjusting shelter to maximize the stability of their fire. This architectural experimentation prepared them for the far larger innovations that would follow many millennia later. Most importantly, the hearth-shaped human identity. Humans began to think of themselves not just as individuals or as members of a band, but as part of a lineage connected through shared places and shared flames. The hearth carried memories forward. Children grew up knowing that the fire they tended was born from embers carried by ancestors. Every hearth was a link in a chain stretching back through time. This sense of continuity, fueled by place, fire, and memory, laid the foundation for the next great leap. Once humans learned to return to places and protect their fires, they only needed one more insight to step decisively toward settlement. Fire wasn't just shaping their lives, it was shaping their world, and this realization would culminate in one of the greatest turning points in human evolution. The million-year story of flame and flesh was reaching a tipping point. For hundreds of thousands of years, fire had been a companion, a teacher, a catalyst. But now, slowly and steadily, humans were beginning to realize a profound truth. Fire was not just a part of their world. Fire was changing what they were. This moment, a million-year turning point, marked the dawn of humanity's first great technological revolution. It is difficult, from the perspective of the modern world with its electricity and engines, to feel the gravity of this change. But imagine standing in the shoes of a human 1 million years ago. You are no longer simply reacting to nature, you are reshaping it. You are no longer entirely vulnerable to night, you carry light with you. You are no longer bound by the raw limits of the body. Fire amplifies your strength, your reach, your nutrition, your safety. No other creature on Earth held a relationship with an elemental force like this. It was unprecedented, and it would ripple through evolution with consequences so far-reaching that they touch every human life today. At this turning point, the mastery humans had achieved was not yet the spark from stone ignition that would emerge tens of thousands of years later. Instead, mastery showed itself in reliability. Humans could keep fire alive for months. They could transport embers across landscapes. They could predict how flames behaved in different environments. They could erect shelters around it and shape their daily cycles around its rhythms. Fire had become an extension of human intention, something guided, not merely observed. This shift changed the pace of technological advancement. With fire at the center of life, humans had the time and security needed to explore, innovate, and adapt. Stone toolmaking accelerated dramatically. Blades became thinner and sharper through heat treatment. Spears became more durable. Wooden tools took on new forms. Digging sticks hardened by flame for foraging, pointed stakes for fishing, straightened shafts smoothed with burning coals. The world of tools expanded not because humans suddenly grew smarter, but because fire created the conditions that allowed intelligence to flourish. Human migration also accelerated. With fire in hand, no environment was unreachable. Cold nights in highlands became survivable. Dense forests could be navigated. Wind-swept plains could be crossed. Fire provided heat, cooked food, and kept predators at bay. It allowed families to sleep peacefully in places their ancestors would never have attempted to stay. Over many millennia, this increased mobility reshaped the human footprint across Africa and eventually the world. But fire didn't just expand where humans could go, it expanded who they could be. Diets improved because fire made more foods edible, more calories available, and more nutrients absorbable. Cooked food required less intense chewing, which gradually changed jaw structure and facial anatomy. Shorter digestive tracts evolved in tandem with higher calorie meals. The brain, an organ hungry for energy, grew larger, more complex, more capable. Fire made this growth possible by drastically increasing caloric efficiency. At the same time, fire altered social life in ways that fundamentally rewired human cognition. Gatherings around the hearth became the first consistent social space in evolutionary history, a nightly ritual that stabilized relationships and deepened connection. In the firelight, humans shared experiences through gesture, taught skills through mimicry, processed emotions through expression, and rehearsed memories. Even without language, the hearth became a communication engine. This increase in social complexity fueled another leap: planning. Humans began thinking in longer time frames. They considered how much wood to gather for the night. They anticipated storms and sought sheltered burns. They remembered which trees burned best, which roots provided steady fuel, which caves channeled smoke safely. Firekeeping demanded foresight, and foresight reshaped the human mind. Fire also changed humans' relationship with fear. Before fire, night was an enemy. With fire, night became manageable, even productive. The psychological shift was enormous. A species defined by vigilance found the first taste of safety, an experience that encouraged curiosity, play, exploration, and experimentation. These traits, once risky luxuries, became advantageous. In this era, humans also began manipulating ecosystems in deliberate ways. Controlled burns reshaped landscapes, attracted grazing animals, reduced wildfire intensity, and maintained open grasslands. Humans were becoming ecosystem engineers. Though they did not set out to change entire biomes, their use of fire had dramatic effects over time. Forests thinned, grasslands expanded, herbivore patterns shifted. Humans were no longer just participants in their environment, they were influencers of it. This newfound power carried psychological implications. Whether they recognized it or not, humans were beginning to feel the first stirrings of agency, an intuitive sense that the world could be shaped by their actions. This feeling would later seed innovation, ambition, and the drive to build more complex societies. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of this turning point was continuity. Before fire, human life was episodic and unpredictable. With fire, patterns emerged: nightly gatherings, seasonal returns to familiar shelters, generational knowledge passed through demonstration. Fire created stability, and stability created memory. Memory created culture. This moment, stretching across countless generations, marked a break from the deep ancient past of purely instinct-driven survival. Humans were stepping into intentionality, into craftsmanship, into pattern recognition, into cooperation, into imagination. And though they did not yet build permanent villages or farm the land or write the first stories, their firelit shelters already held the essence of what civilization would one day become: shared space, shared knowledge, shared identity. It was not a single discovery, not a single invention, not a single brilliant leap. It was a slow, glowing awakening sustained over nearly 1,000,000 years. Fire was the thread that tied those years together. It warmed bodies, sharpened minds, softened food, strengthened tools, and illuminated nights. It inspired rituals and shaped memories. It carved the early foundations of home, community, and technology. This was humanity's first great technological revolution: quiet, patient, elemental. And from it, the final transformation emerged. Fire didn't just change human evolution, it changed human destiny, shaping who we ultimately became. Fire had been a companion for hundreds of thousands of years now, one they had learned to keep, to guide, to protect, and to trust. And in this final stretch of our story, we arrive at the moment where its impact crystallizes into something unmistakable: the flame that made us human. For fire did not merely help our ancestors survive, it helped them become something entirely new. Imagine a quiet evening in a rocky shelter shaped by wind and time. Outside, the plain stretches into darkness, punctuated by distant calls of night animals. Inside, a small group sits around a hearth that glows a steady, pulsing orange. The fire is neither fierce nor weak. It burns with the practiced balance of hands that have tended it since dusk. The faces around it are calm, their expressions softened by warmth. A child sleeps against a parent's leg. An elder chips at a stone tool. Someone lifts a half-burned stick, watches sparks leap from its tip, and places it carefully back into the coals. In this single, ordinary moment lies the culmination of 1,000,000 years of change. Fire had given early humans continuity. It turned nights into extensions of the day, granting hours for reflection, bonding, teaching, and planning. With those hours came imagination. In firelight, shadows looked like animals or ancestors or spirits. The human mind began weaving patterns, forming symbolic thoughts, connecting experiences into stories long before those stories had words. Fire ignited the human capacity for narrative, which in turn forged shared identity. Without shared stories, even gestures, feelings, reenactments, no complex society could ever take root. Fire was the earliest stage on which the imagination learned to perform. The flame also expanded cooperation to unprecedented levels. Maintaining fire required teamwork, gathering fuel, tending embers, shielding wind, carrying sparks over distance. No individual could manage it alone for long. The hearth encouraged shared responsibility, which deepened trust and reinforced cooperation in hunting, foraging, and shelter building. Cooperation strengthened the group, and the group strengthened the individuals within it. Human survival depended not on teeth or speed or claws, but on each other, and fire illuminated that truth every night. The biological changes were just as profound. Fire reorganized the human body from the inside out. Cooked food allowed for smaller jaws and smaller teeth, reducing the need for massive chewing muscles and freeing skull space for expanding brains. Richer calories and softer diets supported rapid energy intake, allowing the brain, an organ voracious for fuel, to grow in ways no other primate's brain could. Fire shaped digestion, behavior, sleep cycles, and metabolic efficiency. Without fire, the modern human form simply would not exist. Even the structure of human time changed. Before fire, the day ended abruptly at sunset. After fire, the night became a domain of human activity. Those additional hours each evening were filled with tasks that required patience and foresight: tool-making, hide processing, social grooming, planning the next day's movements. These activities strengthened executive functions, reinforced cognitive flexibility, and helped early humans rehearse the future. Planning was no longer a rare instinctive response. It became a nightly practice woven into the rhythm of the hearth. Fire also transformed relationships between generations. Elders, whose wisdom was invaluable but whose bodies were vulnerable, found warmth and safety in fire-lit shelters. Their knowledge of migration routes, seasonal changes, resource locations, fire-keeping techniques became a shared treasure carried by the group. Children, sitting at their feet, absorbed this wisdom in the soft glow of the flame. Fire kept the old alive long enough to teach, and kept the young secure long enough to learn. This intergenerational stability seeded the earliest forms of culture. Meanwhile, the landscape itself bore the signature of human fire. Grasslands widened under planned burns, forest edges retreated. Plant species adapted to frequent fire regimes. Grazing animals multiplied in numbers and patterns shaped by human influence. Humans became the first species to remodel entire ecosystems intentionally, even if unintentionally at first. The relationship between humans and land shifted from adaptation to management. Fire was the tool of that transformation. Emotionally, fire became an anchor of safety, comfort, and identity. It warmed bodies, yes, but it also warmed something deeper, a sense of belonging. The hearth became a symbol of home before homes truly existed. Returning to a familiar shelter where an old fire pit still marked the ground evoked memory, connection, and continuity. A fire burning in the dark said, "We are here. We have survived another day. We are together." That emotional foundation is reflected in human cultures around the world, where fire remains central in ceremonies, gatherings, and spiritual practices. Fire also taught humans about cause and effect in ways no other natural force could. It responded to fuel, wind, arrangement, and attention. It rewarded care and punished carelessness. It demanded respect. This relationship nurtured an early sense of responsibility, an understanding that the world could be shaped, regulated, and guided, but not fully controlled. This delicate dynamic between mastery and humility laid the groundwork for all future human innovation. And at the deepest level, fire ignited the first sparks of meaning. Watching flames flicker in the darkness inspired reflection on life, death, and the invisible forces that governed both. Smoke rising into the night sky hinted at worlds beyond. Embers fading to ash mirrored the cycle of existence. These fire-lit moments were the earliest stirrings of spirituality, philosophy, and art. Fire carved the emotional pathways humans would later travel through myth, religion, and storytelling. By the end of this million-year era, humans were no longer simply clever primates. They were collaborative, imaginative, emotionally complex, cognitively advanced beings living in structured communities, connected through shared rituals and shaped by symbolic thought. They were, in every meaningful sense, human. And fire, humble, fragile, powerful fire, was the catalyst of this transformation. It did not give humans civilization, not yet. It did not give them agriculture, cities, writing, or metallurgy. But it gave them the foundation for all of those things, the ability to gather, to plan, to imagine, to teach, to shape environments, to adapt across continents, to preserve knowledge, to feel belonging, to see possibility. Fire lit the path that humanity would follow for the next million years. And from that ancient partnership, from the first trembling approach to a lightning-sparked blaze to the careful tending of a hearth deep inside a cave, emerged the beings who would go on to build civilizations, dream in symbols, and light the night with their own creations. This is why fire is remembered not only as a tool or a discovery, but as a turning point so vast it redefined our destiny. It is, quite simply, the flame that made us human.